to provide just like a visual description of my screen for anyone who needs it. My screen is just showing like my head. I have kind of shoulder, a little longer than shoulder length, brown hair, brown eyes. I'm in my 40s. I'm a Native Hawaiian woman with light skin. I'm wearing a sweater and a Kealo Pico dress. And yeah, again, I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. I guess one other kind of thing to say from the outset is just a content warning. In the talk today, I'll be talking about the history of the institutionalization of children in Hawaii, which is just undeniably a heavy topic. I won't be sharing any like graphic depictions of physical violence in my talk, but nonetheless, just to put it out there that it's a heavy topic, and please do whatever you need to take care of yourself during my talk. Okay, with that, let me pull up a couple screens. I do have a few slides to share while I'm talking. Let's see if I can organize my screens in a way that I can read my talk and show the slides. Okay. So yeah, the title of my talk today is Pathologizing Native Hawaiian Parents, Eugenics in Hawaii Territorial Institutions. So in 1936, a young woman around the age of 20, let's call her Mary, that's not her real name, appears in the bureaucratic records of the Hawaii State Archives as a problem that officials had tried to solve through repeated transfers to different state institutions. Unfortunately, by 1936, Mary had been through every possible institution and no one wanted her anymore because not only did she keep running away, she also incited other young women to do the same. One day, after attempting to help some girls escape, one report reads, it was necessary to place her in seclusion because her resistance was of such a nature that we could not otherwise keep her in Waimano home. The same day Mary was released from solitary confinement, the report adds, she attempted with another girl to overcome an attendant and to take her keys, so it was necessary to put her in seclusion again. Waimano Home, opened in 1921, was situated on 612 acres of territorial land overlooking Pearl City and Pearl Harbor on the leeward side of Oahu. Before the opening of Waimano, so-called feeble-minded children, or so-called juvenile defectives, as one study put it, would have been committed to the territory's industrial schools, the Waiale'e Industrial School for Boys, which opened in 1903, or the Industrial School for Girls, which opened in 1904, first at Keoneula, just outside of Honolulu, and later in Mo'iliili, before finally opening a new campus in Kailua in 1929. And I think on this slide is just a very basic map showing you the locations of the many institutions that I'm researching. They're all on the island of Oahu. But as those schools became overcrowded, the industrial schools became overcrowded, and their superintendents argued that so-called feeble-minded wards made their gendered rehabilitation of delinquent boys and immoral girls more difficult. They advocated for a specialized institution for the feeble-minded, which would become Waimano. So my talk today will say a bit about how fears of so-called feeble-mindedness and the related pathologizing of Native Hawaiians as unfit parents played out at each of these institutions. But first, let me provide a brief sketch of what was happening in Hawaii at this time for those who may be unfamiliar. In 1893, the Hawaiian kingdom was forcibly overthrown by a cadre of white settlers. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed by the United States and officially became a U.S. territory in 1900. There was widespread resistance among the Native Hawaiian people to annexation. Hawaii was made the 50th state of the Union in 1959, So when I'm referencing the territorial period during my talk, I'm referring to this period between 1900 and 1959. So what did it mean for Hawaii to become a U.S. territory? Popular understandings of Hawaii often assume the inclusion of Hawaii within the U.S. as a predestined fate, written along a teleology that ends in U.S. statehood. The reality is much more complex. For example, historian Ronald Williams Jr. argues that the formation of a territorial legislature posed a significant threat to the white oligarchy. In the government formed after the kingdom's overthrow, only white men and certain Native Hawaiian men of wealth were allowed to vote. Though Stanford B. Dole, the first territorial governor, and a participant in the overthrow, as well as others, fought against this reenfranchisement, the incorporating documents of the territorial government reenfranchised many Native Hawaiians and other non-white residents. When the first Hawaii Territorial Legislature convened in 1901, the Independent Home Rule Party won majorities in both the Territorial Senate and House of Representatives. As Williams Jr. also points out, these Native Hawaiian Home Rule representatives proceeded to introduce policies that would restore rights to the people. These efforts were blocked by the territorial governor's veto and other obstructionist measures, while the press propagated explicitly racist depictions of the Home Rule Party, whom they called the Heathen Party, as monkeys. In this context, it's important to move away from understanding the territorial period as a totally smooth transition from the Republic of Hawaii, which was what those who overthrew the kingdom government called their new government, or as a relatively benign period where Native Hawaiians faded into the background. The territorial government's attempts at assimilating Native Hawaiians and other non-white residents of Hawaii into white American culture during the territorial period were far from guaranteed to succeed. Institutions like Waimano Home and the industrial schools thus can be understood as one concerted effort on the part of a threatened white settler elite to eliminate Hawaiian culture and train Native Hawaiian and other non-white children of the territory to understand themselves as part of a multiracial and multicultural Hawaii, nonetheless structured by white heteropatriarchal norms. So to return to Mary's story, before her stint at Waimano, Mary had also previously been incarcerated at the Kawailoa Industrial School for Girls. When officials at Waimano reported they no longer wanted to keep Mary, officials at Kawailoa did not mince words. "We have had a lot of trouble with this girl, and we do not want her back in the industrial school." Waimano officials pushed back, citing Stanley Porteous, a psychologist at the University of Hawaii, who was known for perpetuating racist ideologies about the supposed inferior intelligence of Native Hawaiians and Filipinos, especially in Hawaii. Porteous created an intelligent quotient or IQ test, the Porteous-Mays test, which was regularly given to children at Waimano and the industrial schools. It was also given to their parents and used as evidence to support his racist theories. In this case, Porteous claimed that Mary was not truly a feeble-minded person. Similarly, Dr. Eckert, a superintendent of the Territorial Hospital for the Insane, concluded that Mary was a psychotic personality, but without psychosis, whatever that means. No institution wanted Mary anymore, but the board of the Waimano home nonetheless insisted that to turn her loose upon the public seemed to the board an impossible idea. Susan Birch uses the term transinstitutionalization to mean the process of moving individuals from one variety of institution to another as part of sustained containment, surveillance, and slow erasure, which she argues is a potent type of settler colonial removal. Indeed, in the territory of Hawaii, a network of government-run institutions operated in concert to incarcerate and reform children and adults, punishing those who continued to flaunt relatively newly imposed white American norms about wage labor under capitalism and the sanctity of nuclear families within settler colonialism. I do not know what landed Mary in an institution for the first time, but odds are it was a perceived sexual offense. This is what landed the majority of young women there, anything from associating with boys to being pregnant out of wedlock. When I started my current research project, I thought it was going to be about the history of one place, Ko'olau Girls' Home, a later name for the Kawailoa Industrial School for Girls, where my tutu or grandmother used to work in the 1960s and 1970s. This place held a lot of charm, and my mother and auntie's stories about it. They remember going to Christmas parties in the big gym on campus and how nice the pool was. They remember the girls who were at the home as ranging from the merely kolohe or mischievous to the really bad. As I got further into the research and saw more and more stories like Mary's, it made less and less sense to look at just one place. Actually, that's part of how the violence of trans-institutionalization gets covered up when we look at only one place or only one aspect of the story. This history is not about bad girls. It's about how settler colonialism pathologized Native Hawaiian and other communities of color for caring for each other in ways that threatened the fragile settler colonial order. For instance, Native Hawaiians practiced forms of open adoption that extended the support for raising children beyond two biological parents. Traditionally, grandparents instead of parents were often primarily responsible for raising children. Today, this and other forms of hanai, or a kind of open adoption of children between friends or family members, are still regularly practiced. But white reformers in the territorial era of Hawaii saw such practices as parents so-called abandoning their children. In this twisted strain of settler colonial logic, hanai adoptions, when understood as an abandonment instead of care, were subsequently depicted as a root cause of delinquency in hanai children. This racist depiction of Native Hawaiian parents as unfit was promoted in other arenas as well. In 1891, 2 years before the Hawaiian Kingdom would be overthrown, W.D. Alexander, a powerful white settler in Hawaii, wrote a book entitled A Brief History of the Hawaiian People. Published by the Hawaii Board of Education, the book would be widely used as a textbook in Hawaii schools for decades. In this text, Alexander disseminated a number of racist representations of Native Hawaiians, including the perception that infanticide was widely practiced in ancient Hawaii. It was the opinion of those best informed, Alexander wrote, that 2/3 of all children were destroyed in their infancy by their parents. The cause, Alexander went on to explain, was laziness, unwillingness to take the trouble of rearing children. Such spurious arguments about the supposed high rates of infanticide among ancient Hawaiians does not align with much traditional knowledge about children from Hawaiian language sources. As documented by the Hawaiian scholar Mary Kavena Pukui, there are a wealth of olelo no eau, proverbs or wide sayings about how precious children are. One of the olelo no eau that guides my research on this topic is hele puina ole keiki, meaning a child is like a lei, a flower garland, never forgotten. This saying invokes the image of a baby being cradled in a parent's arms or a toddler hanging around a caregiver's neck, likening such intimate moments to a fragrant lei that graces someone in special moments of celebration or honor. In the face of such clear statements of how precious children are within Hawaiian epistemologies, how did the territorial government perpetuate the lie that Native Hawaiian families were unfit to raise children? One method was through deploying the logics, the tools of eugenic social science, specifically IQ testing as advanced by Stanley Porteous. For instance, a key reason often remarked upon to explain the cause of the delinquency of the boys incarcerated at the industrial school at Waile'e was their supposed low mentality. In a 1934 report, the superintendent of Waile'e notes the need for more psychological testing and the transfer of so-called morons and feeble-minded boys to Waimano Home. A major section of Porteous' comments in a 1949 report on the boys at Waile'e similarly focuses on their intelligence. Undoubtedly, Porteous saw what he called the Hawaiian and Oriental boys, which would have been the vast majority of the Waile'e population, as mentally inferior to Caucasians, a finding consistent with his observations in his 1926 book, co-authored with Marjorie Babcock, called Temperament and Race, where he argued that Hawaii's non-white population averaged 73.3% of the intelligence of white people, with Filipinos and Hawaiians having the most racial defects. Thus, he noted that spending much money on attempting to seriously educate such populations would be akin to what he said was helping lame dogs over stiles, and when they are over, they are still lame. Notably, this book was based on research produced for the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association after the 1924 sugar strike on Kauai that resulted in the deaths of 16 Filipino workers, which is known as the Hanapepe Massacre. As Dean Serenilio notes, such research was supposed to help white settler leaders better understand and control Hawaii's non-white population. Let's see, the difference to Porteous between the delinquent and the feeble-minded was that the delinquent was capable of some industry, though they lacked the ability or desire to fit in with society, as opposed to the feeble-minded who was intellectually unable to participate in society. In making such distinctions, Porteous promoted his own intelligence test, the Porteous-Mays test, over other commonly used IQ tests like the Stanford-Binet test as more accurate. It also allowed Porteous to reserve the Waile'e population as proper subjects for agricultural labor, as they were routinely required to work to provide food for the school, as well as those as they were also routinely hired out. Sorry, I'm giving myself a 5-minute reminder. As they were routinely required to work to provide food for the school, as well as hired out to work on nearby sugar and pineapple plantations. These distinctions Porteous made about the male youth of Waile'e fit with broader trends across the United States that understood female feeble-minded people as the greater threats to the national gene pool, and thus more deserving of indefinite institutionalization and or sterilization. So girls were committed to kawailoa in large part for perceived sex offenses, as I said before. The blame for this immorality was the child's family and by extension, Native Hawaiian culture more broadly. The majority of the girls committed because of sex delinquencies are part Hawaiian and are from families known to many social agencies, notes a 1938 report. A sex delinquency did not need to involve actual proven sexual relations, but merely the appearance of improper association with boys or men. The primary end goal of rehabilitation at Kawailoa was to train girls to be more moral and equipped to perform domestic labor so they could work as maids in wealthy homes until they married and kept homes for themselves. One acceptable reason for parole from Kawailoa, in fact, was, and to some the most desired outcome, was if a girl was to be married. Such marriages required the prior permission of the juvenile court and or the Board of Industrial Schools. We can think of this transfer from Kawailoa to marriage as a different but related kind of trans-institutionalization as transfers from the training schools to Waimano home. Marriage was a territorial institution too, which sought to rehabilitate common Native Hawaiian forms of intimacy and kinship into a heteropatriarchal structure that aligned with white settler colonial norms. Legal marriage was not uniformly valued by Native Hawaiians, and common law relationships, so-called common law relationships, which could be easily dissolved as desired by either party, were and still are widely accepted. So though a heterosexual marriage was presented as the model of success for the future of a girl incarcerated at Kawailoa, presumably one of the reasons why the sexual immorality of Native Hawaiian and Asian girls was of such concern at Kawailoa was the prevalent assumption by social scientists and the general public at this time that they would reproduce similarly immoral children who would also not be beholden to the white settler colonial norms of territorial Hawaii. This concern attached to so-called feeble-minded women in particular ways. As Mike Rambis puts it in his study of a girls' training school in Illinois, girls reproduced, so-called feeble-minded girls reproduced at a much higher rate than their normal-minded counterparts, swelling the ranks of society's unfit. Such concerns nationally spurred many involuntary or coerced sterilization campaigns in many states in the early 20th century. However, this eugenic concern also justified indefinite segregation or incarceration of feeble-minded women, especially of childbearing age, from society. In my research so far, these concerns are not explicitly stated in the records of Kawailoa or Waimano Home. And similarly, I've not seen records of sterilization at these places, but this discourse about the danger of feeble-minded women reproducing at high rates certainly helps explain why the so-called immorality of Native Hawaiian young women would have been so important to check and rehabilitate. Let's see. The families of children sent to the training schools were also subjected to intelligence testing. The results of their tests would be included in the files kept by the social service agencies and used as a rationale for removing children from their families. For example, as noted in a master's thesis on truancy in the schools of Honolulu by Esther Roberts Holmer in 1935, multiple case studies note the so-called mental age of truant boys' mothers. Mrs. Salazar, for instance, the mother of Will, a Portuguese Hawaiian boy of 12 who has been truant, is described as having a Binet mental age of 10 years, IQ 72, Porteous mental age of 9 years. Good rote memory, though retarded ability, showed very little planning, is easily confused and disturbed. Holmer also notes that Will has a low mental age, 10 years, though he's 12 years old, and that since his mother is definitely retarded and at least 2 other children are slow, it is reasonable to suppose that none of the family is very brilliant. Overall, intelligence testing of Native Hawaiian parents provided the territorial government and its agencies seemingly hard scientific evidence that poor and working class Native Hawaiian families were not deserving of having children and that the territory should intervene. Such rationale that pathologized Native Hawaiian families and perpetuated an inherently racist notion that Native Hawaiians had lower mental ages and intelligence than white people could also always be used as an implicit or explicit explanation as to why the industrial schools or Waimano did not often succeed at rehabilitating delinquent boys, wayward girls, or the feeble-minded, despite purporting to be able to. Okay, well, I'm out of time, so let me see if I can say one thing to kind of wrap it up and conclude. I guess, yeah, to conclude, I believe the work of these territorial era institutions should be understood more broadly as a kind of violence that worked to keep Native Hawaiians from more explicit resistance to American colonization. I agree that as with the context of Native American and First Nations children removed by the US and Canadian settler states to boarding or residential schools, the Hawaii territorial institutions that incarcerated Native Hawaiian and Asian children operated as a way to discipline and terrorize not only those children, but their immediate and extended families. While these institutions have left deep wounds, I take heart in the fact that, as with the story of Mary that I began this talk with, many Hawaiian children and their kin never fully believed what the territorial government tried to teach them, but instead continued to maintain their family ties, fight for each other, and relentlessly escape settler colonial attempts to remake them as a people. Okay, thanks.